Hey everyone, tonight we're diving headfirst into one of the most misunderstood aspects of medieval life romance. But forget everything you know about modern dating. In the Middle Ages, there were no dating apps, no casual flings, and definitely no sliding into anyone's DMs. Romance was a battlefield, often, literally. What we'd consider dating today was, back then, a coded, and often brutal system shaped by rigid social hierarchies, religious expectations, property deals, and the ever-looming specter of family honor. Courtship was less about feelings and more about function. Relationships were arranged, strategic, and meticulously monitored. A marriage could determine alliances between powerful families or prevent blood feuds between rival clans. Love, that was optional and sometimes considered suspicious. If you were lucky, love might follow marriage, but more often, affection was a side effect, not the goal. Even the concept of attraction was framed through religious and moral filters. Desire wasn't celebrated, it was controlled. Expressions of interest were cloaked in poetry, songs, or carefully crafted letters, each one dripping with symbolism and rigid protocol. A single touch, a glance held a second too long, could be considered scandalous or even dangerous, depending on who was watching. And while nobility had troubadours to sing of idealized love, common folk had to be far more careful. One wrong move could result in harsh punishment, social shame, or, in some cases, a forced marriage or public flogging. Love was risky, dangerous even, but it was also irresistible, and so people pursued it awkwardly and carefully, within the strict confines of a world obsessed with order. In medieval society, who you loved, or rather, who you married, was never really up to you. From the peasant working the land to the noblewoman behind castle walls, nearly every romantic decision was filtered through family interests, social class, and religious authority. Love was rarely spontaneous. It was arranged, negotiated, and sealed with dowries, land rights, or political advantage. For the upper classes, marriage was often discussed before the child had even learned to walk. A young nobleman's future bride might be chosen when he was still in the cradle, based not on beauty or personality, but on how many horses her family owned or which borders her land could secure. Contracts were signed, alliances formed, and destinies sealed long before the couple ever laid eyes on each other. These were not love stories, they were treaties in lace and parchment. For peasants, the process was only slightly less political. Families still had a say, and while emotional attachment had a little more breathing room, economic survival was the true driving force. Marrying someone from a neighboring village might help with harvest labor, bring more goats into the household, or ensure protection through larger kin networks. Even in love, survival was the real goal. The church also had its COO, and it said a lot. Marriages had to be sanctioned by religious authorities, and many rules dictated who could marry whom. Cousins, too close. Widows remarrying too quickly. Suspicious. A peasant falling for a noble, absolutely not. Forbidden matches weren't just frowned upon, they could result in social ruin or even excommunication. Yes, you could be damned for love. Yet, despite all these barriers, people still found ways to fall for each other. Secret meetings in the woods, love notes passed through servants, a glance during a village festival, or tiny rebellions against the machinery of matchmaking. The stakes were high, and that made the feelings all the more intense. Passion in the Middle Ages wasn't about flowers and flirting, it was a form of resistance, and every kiss stolen was a defiant act. When it came to gender roles in medieval dating, there was no room for flexibility. Society handed each person a role at birth, and straying from it was not only unusual, it was dangerous. Men were expected to lead, propose, provide, and protect. Women were expected to obey, accept, nurture, and remain modest. Anything outside this delicate balance could be seen as immoral, scandalous, or outright sinful. For noble women, courtship was a tightrope walk across a pit of gossip and disgrace. A young lady was expected to be beautiful but not vain, educated but not outspoken, graceful but never seductive. A flirtatious laugh or uncovered hair could ruin her prospects. Everything was monitored: her wardrobe, her posture, even the tone of her voice. A lady's worth was often measured by how well she obeyed and how little she was noticed in the wrong way. Men, meanwhile, were encouraged to pursue it within limits, to forward, and they risked angering a father or a priest. Too timid, and they might lose their chance to a bolder rival. Instead of charm or spontaneity, successful courtship was built on carefully planned gestures. A well-chosen poem, a token left behind at a festival, or a serenade beneath a window. These were the tools of medieval romance. But even those carried risks. If the wrong person saw or heard what you were up to, consequences could be swift and unforgiving. In some regions, courtly love emerged among the elite, a ritualized and often secret game of romantic expression that existed outside the confines of marriage. Knights pledged loyalty to ladies they could never marry. Poems and letters were exchanged in a dramatic dance of passion, longing, and restraint. But make no mistake, this wasn't dating as we know it. It was more like a stylized performance of desire, where feelings were worn like armor and every glance was a calculated move in a very real social game. Meanwhile, among the working class, love had to fit between chores and church bells. A stolen moment behind a barn, a whispered promise on a long walk home, or a shared drink at the village fair. These were the romantic opportunities of the commoner. And even here, the wrong move could cost you dearly. Unmarried pregnancies, forbidden flirtations, or accusations of impropriety could lead to punishments ranging from public humiliation to banishment. In short, romance in the Middle Ages was never just about two people. It was a performance, a negotiation, a strategic game where the rules were strict, the audience was judgmental, and the stakes were higher than any love story would dare admit. Religion wasn't just a part of life in the medieval world, it was life. Every thought, action, and decision passed through the filter of religious doctrine, and this was especially true in matters of romance, love, and marriage. The church had a firm grip on people's hearts, not just spiritually, but legally and socially. Dating, in the way we understand it today, wasn't just discouraged, it was unthinkable. You didn't date or prepared for marriage, and that preparation was full of rules. Premarital intimacy wasn't just frowned upon, it was a sin punishable by both religious and civic authorities. Young lovers caught in compromising situations could face public shaming, corporal punishment, or be forced into marriage as a corrective measure. Virginity was considered a sacred asset, especially for women. A girl's chastity wasn't just her own business, it was a reflection of her family's honor, and losing it before marriage could bring disgrace, not just to her, but to her entire household. Clerics and priests acted as moral guardians. They monitored behavior at festivals, warned against temptations during sermons, and sometimes even intervened in relationships. Religious festivals that allowed for mingling, such as harvest feasts or saints' days, were watched closely. It was the church's job to protect souls from sin, and any flirtation that strayed too far could quickly become a matter of spiritual concern. Marriage itself was seen as a sacred sacrament, not a personal choice. Consent was required, yes, but it was often a formality, especially among the elite. Families arranged unions for strategic reasons, and once the church blessed it, the marriage was expected to last until death. Divorce, in the modern sense, didn't exist. Annulments were rare and difficult to obtain, and only granted under exceptional circumstances, like proving the marriage was never consummated, or that the union was unlawful due to kinship. Even within marriage, intimacy was regulated by religious calendars. There were holy days, fasting periods, and times of penance when sex was forbidden. The act was tolerated only when it served a purpose, namely, procreation. Passion for its own sake was viewed as indulgent and sinful. Even within wedlock, husbands and wives were expected to be dutiful, not affectionate. So while love existed and often flourished, despite the rules, it was always walking a tightrope. Romance had to be veiled, careful, and above all, holy. To fall in love was acceptable. To act on it without approval, that was dangerous. In a world where sin was monitored and salvation was always just one confession away, love had to wear a cloak of virtue even when it burned beneath the surface. If medieval romance had a fantasy mode, it was called courtly love, born from the poetic traditions of the nobility. This was a carefully curated ideal of romantic devotion, elevated, restrained, and unattainable. A noble knight would dedicate his undying love to a lady, often one already married, pledging his service, loyalty, and poetry in her honor. It was emotional, symbolic, and, in theory, entirely non-physical. Courtly love wasn't about running off together into the sunset. It was about suffering gracefully for love. The knight might duel for her honor, wear her colors into battle, or compose verses of longing, and the lady, she would respond with polite distance, dignified encouragement, and maybe, just maybe, a token like a handkerchief or a glance at a feast. That was all, and that was enough. But here's the catch. Courtly love was meant to be impractical. It wasn't about achieving a relationship, it was about the struggle. It glorified the pain of unfulfilled desire and the beauty of restraint. In some ways, it was safer than real relationships because it lived in the realm of imagination and metaphor, and yet, it was dangerous in its own way, especially when the fantasy threatened to become real. Because let's be honest, Not everyone was content with longing from afar. Sometimes courtly love led to secret rendezvous, forbidden trysts, or scandalous affairs. And when that happened, when a nobleman's wife and her poetic admirer crossed the line, the consequences could be deadly. Adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a legal crime and a social earthquake. For women, especially, being caught in such a situation could destroy reputations, families, and lives. Men might duel over it. Entire estates could change hands. Honor wasn't a soft concept, it was a brutal currency, and losing it had real costs. The higher your status, the more tightly you were watched, and the more pressure you faced to maintain the illusion of purity and decorum. Meanwhile, for commoners, there was no fantasy to hide behind. Their romantic lives were raw, practical, and often dictated by survival. While they might not have written odes or danced under moonlight, they had their own codes, quiet meetings by the fields, whispered promises, shared bread. Their love was not less real, just less dramatized. So whether you were playing the dangerous game of courtly love in a candlelit castle or navigating discreet affections behind a village barn, romance in the Middle Ages always came with risk. Hearts beat fast, but they beat carefully. Because in this world, love wasn't just a feeling, it was a gamble. If you thought navigating love in the Middle Ages was already complicated, just wait until religion steps in, because the church had a lot to say about your heart's desires. Love, lust, marriage, and even thinking about someone in the wrong way were all governed by strict moral codes. You didn't just answer to your family or your lord, you answered to God and to a clergy that was watching very, very closely. The church didn't just frown on casual intimacy, it actively campaigned against it. Premarital sex was considered a grave sin, and even romantic affection without the intent of marriage could be seen as a moral failing. Want to hold hands? Better be married. Want to kiss? That might earn you a stern sermon or a public whipping. Want to sneak away behind the chapel with your secret lover? That could get you excommunicated, or worse, married off immediately to fix the scandal. And don't forget confession. If you slipped, if you crossed a line, you were expected to confess not just to God, but to a priest, who might assign penance, prayer, or punishment. Guilt was baked into the system. Every temptation was framed as a test of your soul. Every desire was a threat to your purity. The ideal relationship, according to church doctrine, was one that served God, produced children, and upheld the sanctity of marriage. Anything else, dangerous, damning, devilish. Of course, this didn't stop people from falling in love or lust. But it did mean that much of medieval romance lived in the shadows, in secret notes, in symbolic gifts, in stolen glances at mass. Courtships had to walk a fine line between reverence and rebellion. Too much boldness and you were a sinner. Too little passion and you were cold. It was a tightrope walk, and the fall could be steep. For women, the stakes were especially high. A reputation for impropriety could ruin a girl's chances at a good marriage or at marriage at all. Virginity was prized like treasure, and if a woman was found lacking it before marriage, she might be cast out, hidden away in a convent, or forced to marry beneath her station. Her value wasn't just in who she was, but in what others believed she had or hadn't done. And yet, in the midst of all this control, love still found ways to bloom. Some people risked everything for forbidden passion, others obeyed every rule but still felt deeply, quietly, with a strength that needed no public display. The church may have tried to dictate how people loved, but it could never fully extinguish the fire of desire or the pull of the heart. So, the next time you send a flirty emoji or sneak a kiss on the first date, just remember back then, that could have landed you in a confessional ... or a cage. In a world so tightly bound by rules, customs, and religious dogma, what happened when people defied them? When hearts rebelled against duty, and passion refused to bow to protocol? That's when medieval romance stepped into dangerous territory, into the realm of forbidden love. In a world so tightly bound by rules, customs, and religious dogma, what happened when people defied them? When hearts rebelled against duty, and passion refused to bow to protocol? That's when medieval romance stepped into dangerous territory, into the realm of forbidden love. Affairs of the heart outside sanctioned marriage were not just frowned upon, they could be lethal. For nobles, adultery wasn't merely a personal failing, it was treasonous. A queen caught in an illicit affair could face exile, imprisonment, or even execution. For lower classes, the punishments were often public and humiliating: stocks, shaming, beatings, and forced marriages. But despite the risks, forbidden love persisted, like weeds growing through stone. These romances thrived in the shadows. Lovers exchanged letters written in flowery Latin or coded symbols. passed secretly by handmaids or scribes. Gifts were imbued with secret meanings. A handkerchief scented with herbs, a carved wooden token, a flower left on a windowsill at night. These tokens carried more weight than entire conversations, silent, intimate declarations of devotion that defied the world around them. Sometimes, these affairs weren't just romantic, they were political. Powerful lords took mistresses, queens kept discreet lovers, and even members of the clergy broke their vows behind locked doors. Love was powerful, yes, but it was also weaponized, manipulated, and controlled. A well-placed affair could shift allegiances, blackmail enemies, or spawn illegitimate heirs who might one day threaten dynasties. But it wasn't all strategy. Many forbidden lovers were simply people pulled together by forces larger than themselves. Loneliness, curiosity, longing. Their passion burned brighter because it wasn't allowed. Every moment together was dangerous. Every touch, every word had to be stolen. And that danger made the feelings deeper, more desperate, more intoxicating. These stories rarely ended well. Lovers were separated, shamed, imprisoned, or killed. Sometimes their stories became cautionary tales, passed down as moral lessons. But sometimes, they became legends, whispers of love so fierce it refused to die, even in death. So while medieval society may have tried to suppress unsanctioned love, it couldn't erase it. Love, real, raw, unruly, has always been a force stronger than any rulebook. Affairs of the heart outside sanctioned marriage were not just frowned upon, they could be lethal. For nobles, adultery wasn't merely a personal failing, it was treasonous. A queen caught in an illicit affair could face exile, imprisonment, or even execution. For lower classes, the punishments were often public and humiliating: stocks, shaming, beatings, and forced marriages. But despite the risks, forbidden love persisted. Like weeds growing through stone, these romances thrived in the shadows. Lovers exchanged letters written in flowery Latin or coded symbols, passed secretly by handmaids or scribes. Gifts were imbued with secret meanings: a handkerchief scented with herbs, a carved wooden token, a flower left on a windowsill at night. These tokens carried more weight than entire conversations, silent, intimate declarations of devotion that defied the world around them. Sometimes, these affairs weren't just romantic, they were political. Powerful lords took mistresses, queens kept discreet lovers, and even members of the clergy broke their vows behind locked doors. Love was powerful, yes, but it was also weaponized, manipulated, and controlled. A well-placed affair could shift allegiances, blackmail enemies, or spawn illegitimate heirs who might one day threaten dynasties. But it wasn't all strategy. Many forbidden lovers were simply people pulled together by forces larger than themselves. Love, loneliness, curiosity, longing. Their passion burned brighter because it wasn't allowed. Every moment together was dangerous. Every touch, every word had to be stolen. And that danger made the feelings deeper, more desperate, more intoxicating. These stories rarely ended well. Lovers were separated, shamed, imprisoned, or killed. Sometimes their stories became cautionary tales, passed down as moral lessons. But sometimes, they became legends, whispers of love so fierce it refused to die, even in death. So while medieval society may have tried to suppress unsanctioned love, it couldn't erase it. Love, real, raw, unruly, has always been a force stronger than any rulebook. In a society where emotions had to tiptoe through a labyrinth of expectations, people turned to symbolism to express what they couldn't say aloud. Love, in medieval times, was not only a secretive endeavor, was also steeped in superstition, omens, and coded gestures. When words were dangerous and direct expression was discouraged, every flower, glance, and object became loaded with meaning. A red rose wasn't just a flower, it was a bold declaration of desire. A handkerchief dropped by accident could signal affection. A ring engraved with specific symbols might serve as a silent vow of loyalty. Even the placement of a brooch or the style of a woman's veil at a gathering could be used to communicate feelings without ever speaking. These subtle cues created an intricate emotional language, one that lovers learned to read like sacred scripture. And then there were the superstitions. Medieval Europe was a world where love and magic frequently overlapped. People believed in love potions, charms, and spells to attract or bind a partner's affection. Some would wear amulets inscribed with Latin prayers. Others would bury personal items under thresholds or carry talismans made from hair, herbs, or carved wood. These rituals weren't just for fun, they were taken seriously, often passed down through generations as secret knowledge. Astrology also played a curious role. The alignment of stars and planets was believed to influence compatibility, mood, and passion. A favorable horoscope could bless a match. An ill-starred chart might doom it. Some families even consulted astrologers before allowing a union, especially among the nobility, who feared political misfortune as much as emotional regret. Love was not seen as random, it was fate, influenced by heavenly forces, earthly rituals, and divine will. And when a love defied logic or brought suffering, people often blamed sorcery or curses. It wasn't uncommon for heartache to be seen not just as personal sorrow, but as a spiritual or magical affliction that had to be cured by prayer or exorcism. In this deeply symbolic and suspicious world, even a simple act like sharing a piece of bread or brushing hands at a well could be pregnant with meaning. Every gesture had layers, every touch carried risk, and every love story, no matter how quiet, was wrapped in mystery, myth, and metaphor. When love, or more often, alliance, moved to the next stage in medieval society, it culminated in a wedding. But forget about tearful vows or personal declarations of love beneath flowered arches. Medieval weddings were not about romance, they were contracts. And those contracts were treated with the seriousness of treaties between kingdoms. For the nobility, a wedding was a display of wealth, lineage, and influence. The ceremony itself might be small and sober, often conducted in a chapel or even at the gates of a church, but the feast that followed was another story. Lavish banquets, tournaments, and days-long celebrations marked the importance of the union, not for the couple's happiness, but for what the marriage meant politically, economically, or socially. The bride was often a young teenager, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, and the groom significantly older. Their union had likely been arranged by their families years before, with dowries negotiated like business deals. Cattle, land, castles, servants, everything had a price and a purpose. The presence of witnesses and a priest made it legal in the eyes of the church, but the true binding force was family strategy. For peasants, things were simpler but not necessarily more romantic. While there was occasionally more personal choice involved, weddings still had to satisfy practical needs. A good match meant shared labor, stronger kin networks, and more security. The church also played a central role here, ensuring the union was legitimate and urging modest celebration if the couple couldn't afford grandeur. Clothing varied by class, but even among the poor, the bride often wore her best garments, sometimes dyed with natural colors or adorned with borrowed finery. Among the rich, silk and fur were popular, with crowns of gold or wreaths of rosemary symbolizing fidelity and prosperity. The groom's attire, too, would signal his family's standing, sometimes featuring emblems or colors representing his house. The actual ritual was focused less on vows and more on exchange. Consent was declared publicly, not whispered in private hand. Tokens were passed: rings, girdles, coins. The couple might share a ceremonial drink, or in some cases, be led to bed as part of the celebration, with guests in attendance to affirm consummation. Yes, it could be that literal. But despite all this pageantry and purpose, not every marriage was cold or mechanical. Over time, some couples grew close, even affectionate. Shared struggles, mutual respect, and the slow unfolding of trust could create bonds stronger than those sparked by passion alone. In many ways, love grew after the wedding, not before. Because in the medieval world, the marriage ceremony wasn't the culmination of a love story, it was the beginning of something far more complicated, more negotiated, and, sometimes, more enduring. The medieval wedding might have marked a legal and religious union, but the true sealing of the marriage, both socially and spiritually, came with the act of consummation. That first night together wasn't just private intimacy, it was proof. Proof of legitimacy, proof of virginity, proof of honor upheld, and, in many cases, proof that the marriage could now be considered fully valid under both church law and societal expectation. In noble households, this moment was often witnessed not directly, but symbolically and ritualistically. The newlyweds might be escorted to their bedchamber by family or guests, offered wine or gifts, and then left to fulfill their duty while everyone else partied outside. In some cases, the bride's sheets would be inspected the next day for bloodstains, seen as undeniable evidence of chastity. Yes, it was invasive. Yes, it was dehumanizing, but in that world, it was tradition, and there was immense pressure, particularly on the bride. She was expected to be inexperienced, yet pleasing, modest, yet fertile. If she failed to bleed, her family might be accused of deception, or worse, she could be publicly shamed and cast aside. The entire honor of her lineage could rest on the outcome of that one night. It was a terrifying burden disguised as a romantic milestone. For the groom, expectations were different but still weighty. He was to take charge, to prove his masculinity and secure an heir. If he failed to perform, the marriage could be annulled. If he was too rough, he could traumatize his new wife. Few had guidance or education on what to do, especially among the lower classes. Intimacy was treated more like obligation than exploration. Among peasants, the rituals were less theatrical, but the expectations remained. Consummation was still required for a marriage to be recognized by the church. If it didn't happen, if one party refused, or if rumors spread that the couple had not shared a bed, priests, or even local authorities might intervene. In some towns, the couple could be brought before a judge and asked to explain themselves in detail. Despite all the pressure and scrutiny, not every first night was cold or traumatic. Some couples managed to find comfort in each other, especially those who had fallen in love despite the odds. A nervous smile, a gentle touch, or even just shared fear could spark a connection. And in that moment, away from the politics and public gaze, something resembling real intimacy could begin to grow. But one thing was certain. Consummation in the medieval world wasn't just a private act, it was a public confirmation, steeped in tradition, expectation, and surveillance. It wasn't just about love or desire, it was about legacy. It's easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a time devoid of passion where duty always trumped desire and romance was buried under layers of protocol and religious guilt. But the truth is far more complex. Beneath the rigid structures of morality and marriage, people still longed, still craved, still sought out pleasure in whatever ways they could. Love and lust weren't erased by the times, they were simply disguised. Of course, physical pleasure was never openly celebrated. The church viewed it with deep suspicion, especially when it wasn't directly tied to procreation. Passion for its own sake was labeled sinful, indulgent, even demonic. Lust was one of the 7 deadly sins, and those who acted on it outside the narrow confines of marriage risked everything from excommunication to social ruin. But human nature doesn't bend easily to dogma. People still explored their desires, often in secret. Lovers met in barns, gardens, and forest clearings. Married couples, despite the rules, sometimes found joy and tenderness in their unions. Even among the clergy who had taken vows of celibacy, there were affairs, hidden children, and whispered scandals that stretched from tiny parishes to the halls of bishops. Erotic literature and art existed, though it was heavily censored and often circulated in secret. Illustrations of the Kama Sutra were copied in cloisters under the pretense of studying foreign cultures. Pilgrims traveling across Europe shared bawdy tales and ribald songs at inns and roadside camps. Sexual humor, crude, vulgar, and vivid, was a staple of peasant festivals and marketplaces. Even in a world draped in piety, the appetite for sensuality never truly disappeared. Certain acts were considered more taboo than others. Anything seen as unnatural or against nature was not only sinful but criminal. Homosexual relationships were harshly persecuted. Masturbation was condemned. Adultery was punishable by law, and accusations alone could ruin reputations permanently, especially for women. And yet, in the quiet corners of daily life, people found ways to express themselves. A lingering touch at the well, a shared cloak during a cold evening, a whispered joke that made someone blush. These were the small rebellions, the quiet affirmations that the body was not just a vessel of sin, but of feeling. For many, passion became a kind of resistance against arranged marriages, against forced celibacy, against a life lived in silence. It was a spark of individuality in a world that often demanded uniformity. In the darkness of the medieval night, when candles were extinguished and watchful eyes were asleep, people reached for one another not just for pleasure, but for connection, for validation, for life itself. In the medieval world, your name was everything. Reputation wasn't just about pride, it was your passport to opportunity, survival, and social standing. A single rumor could change your fate, and nowhere was this more dangerously true than in matters of romance and sexuality. For women especially, reputation functioned like fragile glass, beautiful when intact, but nearly impossible to repair once shattered. A young woman accused of promiscuity, whether the claims were true or not, might find herself barred from marriage, cast out by her family, or branded with shame that followed her for life. A glance seen by the wrong person, a visit from a man after dark, even gossip whispered at the market could lead to consequences far beyond embarrassment. In some cases, the punishment was formal: public humiliation, forced penance, confinement to a convent, but often, it was social exile. A ruined reputation could make a woman invisible to potential suitors, or worse, mark her as fair game for further abuse. Respectable women were expected to be modest, obedient, and utterly beyond suspicion. Anything less, and they risked being recast as cautionary tales, lessons for others to heed. Men too were judged, but not always as harshly. A man with too many affairs might be seen as reckless or dishonorable, particularly if he seduced noble women or crossed class boundaries. Still, male reputation had more elasticity. A lord known for his passions might be scolded, but rarely exiled. A peasant who fathered a child out of wedlock might be pressured into marriage, but he wouldn't lose his livelihood. Yet, even with these double standards, men were not immune to ruin. A knight whose affair embarrassed a queen could be stripped of his titles. A clergyman caught in scandal could be defrocked and exiled. The church, for all its power, had very little patience for broken vows, and public opinion, the most powerful tribunal of all, was swift to judge. Honor was not just a virtue, it was a currency, and like any currency, it could be stolen, spent recklessly, or lost in a single moment of vulnerability. That's why lovers moved so carefully. That's why flirtation wore the mask of poetry, and why affection hid behind tokens and riddles. Because in the medieval world, a damaged name didn't just hurt, it could destroy. Even so, people took the risk. They courted danger for the chance to feel alive, to feel seen, to feel love. And sometimes, just sometimes, they were rewarded not with ruin but with something real. In the medieval mindset, physical intimacy was less about pleasure and more about purpose. Sex was, first and foremost, for procreation. Anything beyond that, passion, experimentation, desire, was treated with suspicion, if not outright condemnation. That didn't stop people from craving or pursuing it, of course, but it did mean that nearly every expression of physical love came with a heavy weight of moral judgment, religious fear, and social risk. The church held particular sway over how sexuality was viewed. Any intimacy outside the confines of marriage was branded a sin. And even within marriage, certain positions or acts were discouraged or forbidden altogether. The idea was that sex should be mechanical, sober, and purely functional. Anything that hinted at pleasure for its own sake was seen as indulgent, carnal, and dangerous to the soul. Despite this, the human body and what it longed for could not be fully tamed. Medieval literature, poetry, and even religious texts occasionally acknowledged the power of physical attraction. Some accounts describe aching hearts, trembling touches, sleepless nights haunted by longing. But these feelings had to be hidden beneath layers of symbolism, metaphor, and spiritual repentance. For couples who defied the rules, secrecy became survival. They met in the woods, in stables, in shadows cast by church walls. Every encounter carried risk. There were no condoms, no birth control, and no legal protections for lovers who found themselves in trouble. An unplanned pregnancy could ruin lives, especially if the parents came from different classes. A woman's future could vanish overnight. A man could be fined, imprisoned, or forced into an unwanted union. Still, desire found ways to bloom. In some villages, ancient fertility rituals continued in secret, woven into local festivals and traditions. These earthy celebrations of the body clashed with official doctrine, yet they persisted, proof that the yearning for closeness, for connection, ran deeper than fear. Among the nobility, physical passion was more carefully masked, but no less intense. Affairs behind castle walls, mistresses kept in guarded chambers, and poetic correspondence laced with innuendo were all ways in which upper-class lovers pushed against the boundaries set by faith and family. Even some royals, bound by political marriages, sought solace in the arms of those they actually desired. In this climate, every caress had meaning. Every kiss carried the potential for discovery, disgrace, or transcendence. Because when love in all its forms is forbidden or judged, even the smallest physical gesture becomes an act of rebellion, of bravery, of truth. And so, despite the rigid rules and relentless eyes watching from pulpits and towers, the physical side of love endured, not because it was allowed, but because it was human. As the medieval world gradually gave way to the Renaissance and modern age, many of its harshest codes around love and intimacy began to loosen, but the echoes of those ancient passions, restrictions, and rituals still resonate even now. The way we love today, the way we flirt, propose, marry, or mourn, so much of it carries traces of what came before. Our yearning for connection has always existed in tension with the rules imposed upon it. The Middle Ages may seem far away, filled with armored knights, candlelit castles, and stern-faced priests, but the emotional core of its romances is timeless. Forbidden love, longing glances, secret meetings, all of it reminds us that love, even under pressure, finds a way, and often, it's at its most powerful when it's not permitted. From noble women hiding letters beneath their silks, to peasants carving their initials into trees, people risked everything for the chance to feel something real. They loved not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. Because to be human is to reach for connection, even when the world says no. And although the rules have changed, love hasn't. We still fall for people we shouldn't. We still write messages full of longing. We still sneak kisses when no one's looking. In some ways, we're not so different from our medieval ancestors. We've just swapped castles for apartments, scrolls for texts, and troubadours for playlists. So the next time you feel a rush of affection, a flutter of desire, or the thrill of someone's eyes lingering on yours, remember, you're re-participating in an ancient tradition. One built not just on joy, but on defiance, on hope, on the fierce, unyielding belief that love is worth it, no matter the cost. In the end, the Middle Ages didn't just teach us how people used to love. It revealed how deeply they needed to, how willing they were to suffer, to sacrifice, to revolt for something as fragile and as powerful as the human heart.